All right, let's get back into Chapter 1. We finished with how to do excavation, although frankly there's a lot more to know about this, but since this is just an introductory course, we'll leave it at that for the time being. I'm probably going to talk a little bit more about excavation techniques in future lectures, but as far as the book is concerned, let's move on. I mentioned in the previous lecture that the previous part of this lecture, I should say, that there are strata that define particular periods of times, horizons as we call them. So horizontal archaeology is the things that you walk around and you do every day. After the buildings or the context, the surfaces, all the stuff that you're using start to become buried through time, through just trampling dirt around, collapse of structures, rebuilding, doing new things, new people coming in. Things start to transform and become stratified. And as time moves on, so do your artifacts, your habits, your styles, all sorts of things start to change. And what we want to do is take all of those elements, those artifacts and ecofacts that we find in a stratum, in a level, a layer, and try and build a picture of what life was like at that time. I mentioned before that that photographs are a really good way of an honest way of documenting things. But I want you to look at figure 113 in your book and on the slideshow that shows a drawing of a pot. Now, this is a good way to demonstrate that an illustration can tell you more about a pot than a photograph can. If you were to photograph a piece of pottery or a whole pot or something, it shows you just what it is visible. But an archaeologist or a specialist in ceramics can actually measure the thickness of the pot from the inside, if there's any interior decoration or finishing features on the interior space, which you can see half of that pot in that figure is the left-hand side is the exterior and the right-hand side is the interior. It also shows the elements of design of things like the handle, the thickness of the handle, the shape of the rim, the curvature of the interior space. So there's a lot of elements that a drawing can do that a photograph can't do on its own. You'd have to take many different photographs and still probably couldn't do everything that this drawing does. So it's a way to consolidate a lot of information into a compact illustration. Now, this is a pot, a pot, and a ceramic vessel, but you can also do this with sites and contexts and horizons. You can do it on maps. So a lot of information can be embedded in illustrations that consolidate a lot of different strands of evidence and put them into one and build up a picture of what might have been taking place from many different perspectives. So that's what we really want to look at right now is what are the things that are filling this space that you find in archaeological contexts, in strata. So artifacts and ecofacts are the two major categories. Now, artifacts, as I explained before, is anything made by human hands. Or there's a sort of blurry line between what an artifact and an ecofact is when there's unmodified things like stones that are brought in, if it hasn't been altered by human hands, but it's definitely been brought in from someplace else. Is it an artifact or an ecofact? Well, probably somewhere in between. We call these manuports. That means someone brought it there, but they didn't change it at all. They didn't do anything with it. Maybe they intended to make something out of a stone that they brought that is of a particular type of stone that's hard, and they wanted to make a tool out of it, right? But they didn't get around to doing it. So it made its way to the site, but it didn't make it very far. So an artifact is something that is an archaeological from an archaeological context that shows traces of human manufacture and modification in most cases. And an ecofact is also an object that's recovered from an archaeological context that is the remains of biological or geological formations. So these are things that are animals or plants or rocks or minerals. An ecofact can be something like a pigment, right? This is a usually either vegetal or mineral remains that are like ochre is a type of rock that can be ground into a paste and applied to dye clothing. Now this can be very important for the way people looked in the past and could be identifiers that these are the people that wore this particular pattern of clothing and these are these people that wore another type of pattern of clothing. We may never get the pattern of clothing, but we can tell that they were dyeing either their skin or their faces or their clothes or their hides or their dwellings, in fact. So we want to be able to, when we're excavating archaeological contexts, we want to be able to pick out every single trace of evidence that tells us about life in the past. But of course, preservation doesn't allow for 100% recovery in most cases. And I mentioned the word taphonomy before, taphonomy. This is the study of the processes that affect, in most cases, organic remains after death, but also the whole site itself. How does time affect the recovery of artifacts and ecofacts? And so differences in preservation will affect and bias what is found on archaeological sites. So in extremely arid climates like we have here, you might actually have some very old organic remains preserved. But in wetter, more humid climates, you might get just complete deterioration of anything organic in a very short period of time. So these post-depositional processes, the things that happen after materials have been left behind and time starts working on them, is affected by the climate, biology, cultural agents as well, things that people and animals do that create changes in the site after occupation. And this can also move stuff around. And so understanding the taphonomic processes help us to put things back into their proper places. We may never be able to get a full understanding of it, but we can say, this doesn't come from here. This was coming from someplace else, so it's not in the right place. I may not know where it comes from, but it's moved from its original deposition point. Maybe a flood came through and clustered a bunch of objects together. Now you might think that cluster of objects that comes together, if you don't understand taphonomy, you may think that some person left them all there together on purpose, but you'd be wrong. You actually need to understand that sometimes post-depositional processes like erosion can flood things and move things around, and tree roots can create big holes in the ground and pull things up and move them around. So part of the excavation process is, like I said before, is excavating from top down, going from the latest thing to the earliest thing, but it's much more complicated than that because taphonomy means that we have to understand how things aren't just simply a nice, neat layer cake, but it's a more complicated process. So how do we look at some of the things that we find, the stuff in our archaeological excavations? Well, you want to quantify it as best as you can. Now, there is no person on Earth who is an expert in every sub-discipline of archaeology that exists. You have people that are interested in particular aspects of the excavation process, the survey process, certain types of artifacts, certain types of ecofacts. And it requires such in-depth knowledge that no one person can know every single thing about everything. So that's why we work together as teams. And one of those sub-disciplines is looking at things like animal bones. What did people eat? What kind of traction animals did they have? Did they hunt or did they cultivate animals? Were they herders? Did they have domesticated species or wild species? Did they have pets? All of these things are things that can be answered, and they're so important to human life that understanding the animal bones in an archaeological context is an important element of who they were, what they were eating, what they were doing, how they were living their lives. And you find a lot of bones often in archaeological contexts. And what do you do with all of these things? Well, there's two main terms that we use to describe the quantification and sampling of bones, of animal bones, or archaeozoology, or zooarchaeology as it's often called. One of them is the number of identifiable specimens, or NISP. And this is basically the count of the fragments of bones or whole bones that you get. Now, this is if you can identify what species it's from, that's terrific, because you're saying, all right, we have this much of an animal. We've got 50 pieces of rabbit bone. But here's the big point here, the big question: how many bones are in a single individual animal? Right? We've got over 200 in our body. So if you find 200 bones, is that one person or is that 200 people? And so this is what the other term, which is MNI, or minimum number of individuals. We each have one right leg and one left leg. We don't have two left legs, we don't have two right legs. So if you find a tibia, a left tibia of a human, or a cow, or a rabbit, or a sparrow, any kind of animal, or a turtle, if you find two of that same element, that same thing, a tibia, then you know that because only one creature, one of these individual animals can have one of these things, then if you find two of them that are the same element, you've got to have two individual creatures. So if you find two of the same portion of a cranium, you know I don't have two heads on my shoulders, which means there's got to be two people, right? So that's the number of identifiable specimens are simply the bones that you find and the species that they're identified with. But that doesn't give you the minimum number of individuals, which is the quantifiable way of saying what was the frequency of individuals in this human context. So this is exemplified in figure 115, where you have a rabbit skeleton, which is different elements of one rabbit, possibly. I mean, it could be more, but they're all different elements, and there's more than 20 that are there. But there's 10 cow tibia bones, right? So the cow has an MNI of 10. It's minimum number of individuals because they're the same bone found 10 times over. But the rabbit skeleton has a MNI only of 1, right? Because they're all different elements. It could be just one rabbit. We don't know. So that's why we're trying to quantify this in a scientific way that goes with the most conservative estimate of these things. You don't want to overplay your hand. And you can get into trouble if you do this wrongly, because people will scrutinize your work, and if you mix these things up, it will mean that the results of what you're trying to describe are not based in scientific fact. So if you find 20 rabbit elements, does that mean that the primary thing that the people in this community were eating was rabbits? Maybe not, because one rabbit is far fewer than 10 cow bones, especially since that's a much larger animal and would feed a lot more people. So, and also a rabbit skeleton is sort of a semi-wild creature. It may not have been cultivated. It could have just wandered into a little hole in the ground and found its way into a settlement and not have been even noticed by the people that were living there. That can't happen with a cow. So, this is where ecofacts can tell us a lot about the way people lived their lives. Artifacts as well can be quantified and sampled. So different types of objects are identified, often based on things like material types. So you've got metal objects, you've got ceramic objects, you've got stone objects, wood objects, and you can create typologies within those material and manufacturing types. So you create inventories and lists of these things, and these give a range of what types of tools they were using, what sort of ritual artifacts they had, special objects of prestige, maybe imported objects, and they all have particular characteristics, size, weight, color, and all of these things are described by the archaeologist. And these are useful for conducting things like statistical analyses. So we build up a picture, and so after excavation has taken place, specialists will look at things like pottery. Chipstone is usually napped, sharpened stones are often treated separately from ground stones. Things like hammers and pestles and mortars and grinding stones are different than an arrowhead or a knife, because the specialists who look at them actually specialize in looking into each of those types. You have metal objects. Where does that metal come from? That can be analyzed. Animal bones, which we've looked at in archaeobotany. Small finds, as they're often referred to, are special objects of prestige or value. And also, we shouldn't overlook the fact that even though we're looking at prehistory now, modern materials also can fall into those categories. So a pipe from 100 years ago could be an archaeological, actually like what I was referring to is like a rusty old metal pipe in the ground for sewage. Can be an archaeological find, depending on who is looking for what information. So artifacts can be classified depending on the culture that's creating them. And this may seem mystifying to you at first, because you've probably seen films, old westerns and things, where some grizzled old miner picks up an arrowhead and says, Apache, and he knows immediately what he's looking at, right? If only it were that easy. We have to build up an impression of what are the styles and the types over a lot of effort and looking at these things stratigraphically to try and piece these things together. What is contemporary? What are things that are stylistic changes through time, and what are things that have different functions at the same time? So think about this. What kind of ceramic vessels might you use, or porcelain vessels? A bowl, a cup, a plate? What kind of metal objects might you use in a kitchen? A fork, a knife, a spoon, right? These are all contemporary objects that have different functions. But do you use a goblet these days? Not typically, not often do we use goblets. That can be a chronological thing, that we don't tend to drink out of goblets these days, unless you're a very avid wine drinker. And so that can be chronological. So we tend to drink out of cups or glasses. Goblets may be from another time period, right? So that's what we have to try and figure out, is what is contemporary and what is from a different time. So we do this by creating chronologies, and there's two types of chronologies that we'll look at here. One of them is relative chronology, and one of them is absolute chronology. And they're both useful. I don't want to say that it may sound like absolute. Why don't we just go with absolute chronologies? Well, because absolute chronologies tell you absolutely what a particular type of thing dates to, but that doesn't tell you what the entire assemblage is moving through time. So a relative chronology is style. So often can be based on artifact typologies. And you can place things in a temporal sequence, but they aren't necessarily directly linked to a calendar date. So you can look at something and you can still today, even, some of you, most of you won't remember the 1950s, for instance. I wasn't alive in the 50s or even the 60s. But I know what stylistically looks like 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s. I can tell decade by decade style moving through different periods of time. Now, I may not be able to tell you exactly when a particular car dates to, or handbag dates to, or shoe style dates to, or clothing style dates to, but I can tell you, that looks older than that one. That's what relative chronology is that, okay, there's a sequence, I don't know when this dates to, but this one is earlier than this one. And that's what relative dating is all about. This relative chronology is saying, I don't know when this is, but this is earlier than this, is earlier than this, is earlier than this. And that can be reinforced by stratigraphy. Stratigraphy isn't giving you a calendar date for when that stratum is, but it can tell you this is earlier than this, is earlier than this. So once you build up this sequence of stratigraphy, you can actually start to take the artifacts in there and say these are stylistically moving through stylistic changes. And if you find them elsewhere, you can say, I know when this dates to in stratigraphically. So you can pick up a pot, a ceramic bowl, and say, this one, I don't look at it in a museum and say, actually, this one is earlier than this other one over here, and even out of its context. So this is what we call seriation, or putting things into order of chronology relative to one another. And this is a method of comparing relative frequency of artifact types between contexts used to create regional relative chronologies. So for an entire area, you can say this, you don't have to have the sequence in every circumstance. You can actually put these into relative chronologies. I have a slide here that shows some pottery.